Okay, so the last presentation in this session is an invited talk by Jeff Bowers. Jeff Bowers is a professor in psychological sciences at the University of Bristol. He works on issues that are important to understand how humans perceive, represent, and store words in memory. And this research is especially valuable because it integrates behavioral experiments with theoretically informed cognitive models. Lately, Jeff has been researching the strengths and limitations of symbolic versus non-symbolic deep neural networks, and I think we'll hear about some of this research in this talk. Welcome.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So this might be a bit of an unusual talk in the sense that there's a lot of vision. I'm talking more about vision than language, but I think my story has relevance to language, and I will mention at least briefly a language study as well. So it is relevant. How do I make the slides go forward? Oh yes, good. Okay, so my work is I've been working with deep neural networks, and as I'm sure you're all aware, there's been a lot of excitement, certainly engineering excitement with these models because they can do quite impressive things in artificial intelligence. So they they have models these days that can do fantastic things with games. Here's an image of a model from DeepMind beating the world's best player in Go. With regard to language, you can translate between language, Google Translate. You can convert speech to text, like speaking into your phone. You can generate, and I'll talk a bit more about this, kind of coherent sentences and text. And you can even generate images from text. This is maybe something you don't know, but if you write in one of these, something called DALL-E 2, a recent model, you write an astronaut riding a horse in a photorealistic style, the model will produce that image. Or teddy bears mixing sparking chemicals as mad scientists as a 1990s Saturday morning cartoon, and the model will produce that image. So it's pretty impressive, okay? And they can even be valuable art. So there's a paper, just an article in the New York Times just recently where people were unhappy, actual artists were unhappy because someone who submitted an art that was produced by AI won the competition. And here's another, on the right-hand side there, art that was generated by AI and sold for $500,000 almost. So, I mean, impressive images can be produced by these models. And the first big success, and the thing that's most relevant to my work and what I'll be talking about, is models are good at classifying and identifying objects. So, we can kind of match or even exceed, oops. Okay. I'm sorry, it disappeared on this side here. These models can match or exceed performance on this kind of competitions, this database called ImageNet that has like 1 million images from 1,000 categories, and the models can recognize these objects very well. So just some examples, you give that picture on the left, the model will say that's probably a picture of a mite, or the second one is a container ship, and so forth. It does as well as humans on these challenging image tasks. So impressive. Certainly impressive engineering, but the question that I'm interested in is whether these are good models of the human mind, okay? And in the case specifically in vision, I mean, we'll see this also becoming more and more common in language, but in the case of vision, people are making quite bold claims, saying these models are really good models of the visual system. So here's just 2 quotes. I could give many more. But deep neural networks provide the current best models of visual information processing in the primate brain. Or deep neural networks trained on object recognition provide the best current models of high-level visual areas in the brain. And more generally, people are making the next quote is just more generally about outside vision. So people are just making bold claims about how these models are really relevant to neuroscience and understanding the biological system that we are, okay? Okay, so that's the context, and my talk is organized as follows. I'm going to describe these brain prediction benchmarks that are used to make these bold claims. And I'll focus on vision, where these claims are the strongest, but again, you'll see some quotes in language as well. And then, so I'm going to criticize the evidence that's used to make these strong claims, and then I'm going to summarize a few studies from my lab and some other labs that that show that these models that are so bloody great actually absolutely catastrophically fail when you test them against psychological experiments. And again, I'll focus on vision, but I'll give one study. It's not really a failure, but I think a problem in the case of vision, language. And so the conclusions, I want to make two general conclusions. One, I think we should stop focusing on predictions and run experiments that and that kind of manipulate independent variables designed to test specific hypotheses. I'll elaborate on that idea. And the other point is I think we need to focus a lot more on psychological findings. I mean, there's this focus on neuroscience and brain, predicting brain patterns, and not enough focus on looking at psychology. So it's kind of a plea for people in modeling to pay more attention to psychology. The people are modeling are engineers and computational neuroscientists, and they don't seem to pay enough attention to psychology, or I'd argue linguists, and when it comes to modeling language, as we'll come to. Okay, so the claim that these models are good or even the best models of biological vision, so focusing on vision for the moment, is that they're best at predicting brain responses to images that are presented to a human being, or in some cases a monkey, and you're recording the brain responses to these images. And the general logic is the better the deep neural networks, the DNN stands for deep neural network, the better the deep neural network can predict. And the way you predict is these deep neural networks have things, I presume basically familiar, where you kind of activate a bunch of units. Those are sort of like neurons. You get a pattern of activation of these units. The better you can use that pattern of activation in this artificial neural network to predict the pattern of activations in the brain, the better the correspondence is between the model and the human brain. So that's the assumption. And let me give you I'll go into detail, not great detail, but a little bit of detail about one of the metrics that people use to make these comparisons, okay? So, and the method is called representational similarity analysis. So, RSA measures how similar two different systems are in the way they each encode similarity amongst themselves. It's kind of a second order similarity statistic. So you present two images. I guess I don't have can I just have a mouse? So you have two systems. In my diagram here, system one and system two. So you might have a human brain and you might have a neural network, okay? And you present those two different systems the same set of pictures. So my data set, you got a picture of a cat and a car and a bird and so forth. So you present both of those systems the same set of images. And then in each system, you measure the pairwise similarity of the representations. So you say, okay, this is how my neural network responds to dogs. This is how my neural network responds to cats. I measure how similar those things are, and I get a similarity between dogs and cats. I get a similarity between dogs and trains, and dogs and and so forth. I get all the pairwise similarities, and I get what I'm calling here a representational geometry. So it's system one represents the similarity of cats and dogs as quite high, but cats and airplanes not so high. And I get a pattern of amongst all the patterns. And I do the same thing with this other system. I get pairs of activations and find out how similar they are. So I have two representational geometries, and I say, well, how similar are those representational geometries? The more similar those are, the assumption is the more similar those two systems are to each other. Okay? So that's the kind of very common method people use to compare neural networks to brains, but different brains to different brains, and so forth. Monkey brains to animal brains, and so human brains. So one of the, I think the first people, Khalid Rezivi, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, and Krieger-Skorte did one of the first studies, or the first study, where they used this method to compare human brain responses to a deep neural network. So they had a set of images organized in these, in a bunch of categories, some inanimate, some are animate. They presented these images, same set of images, to a neural network and to human beings doing fMRI scanning. And they measured the representational similarity. And on this graph, on the right-hand side, so these networks are called deep neural networks because they have many different levels. There are many layers. Sometimes they can have thousands of layers at this point. But anyways, this model didn't have that many, but it had a few. Might have got cut off, but up to 7 anyways. And they measured the representational similarity between the neural network and inferior temporal cortex in humans. And they find the higher up you go in the layer, up to layer 7, all of a sudden you're getting an RSA score of something like approaching 0.3. Now that gray thing that I'm calling the noise ceiling is with the RSA you obtain between different human beings. So that's by this measure and using the noise in fMRI, that's as good as you can hope to get. And this neural network is getting a prediction almost as good as one brain predicts another brain. So that's the kind of conclusion. People say, look at that, this is almost a perfect prediction. And you get titles like deep supervised models may explain IT cortical representation. So people making claims based on these high representational similarity scores that they're capturing something important about IT vision. So there's another common approach. It's a kind of a first order statistic where you just do predict brain activity using linear regression. So this is first one was reported by Dan Yammans, same year as the RSA paper, where they present, in this case, monkeys, a set of images, these images here, from 8 categories, I think it was. And you just present a bunch of those images to the model and to, in this case, monkeys, which they're recording from single cells in inferior temporal cortex, and they make a regression model, say, okay, how well can I predict the neural activity from the activation in my deep neural network? They do this with thousands of different images, and then they say, okay, I've got my regression model, how good can I predict on a held out sample, a set of images that the model hasn't been trained on and hasn't been predict, and they could account for about 50% of the variance. So they could account for a lot of the variance in response, and much higher than any other model. And this graph on the right-hand side here is that the first one was from 2014, 2020. There's been an explosion of research. So many models have come along, and they find a correlation. The better the model, so on the y-axis here, or I guess on the x-axis is how good the model is in identifying images, and on the y-axis how good the predictivity. And there's a correlation. The better the models are in predicting, are better in classifying models, the better they are in classifying, or better they have brain predictivity. As a general rule, again, making claims that these models are getting better and better, higher correspondences between the brain. And now there's this thing called brain score, where you can submit your model and get an overall how well you do on various kind of brain score, kind of these kind of predictions. And they, there's I don't know, 1,000 or hundreds anyways in models, and they rank order. And at the moment, I won't try to pronounce the name of that first model, but that's the #1 model at the moment. Okay, so that's and a quote from the paper: brain score, a composite of multiple neural and behavioral benchmarks to score any artificial neural network on how similar it is to the brain's mechanisms for core object recognition. So they're really, the closer that, higher the prediction, the closer it is to the biological vision. Okay, but my argument, and people in my lab, oops, I didn't start my timer, is the data that they're using are observational data sets, where they have a few observational data. And but what I mean by that is that these data sets, I have one from the left as RSA, and one on the right is the one used for kind of brain score and linear regression, is that they haven't really manipulated anything. They have a bunch of images from different categories, yes, but they haven't varied the size, the location, the texture, the color, or anything systematically, and asked, are these variables important for a human recognition? Or are these models, these variables important for neural network recognition? They just got a kind of an unorganized, non-theoretically motivated set of images, and they do a lot of predictions over those things and get good scores. So that's what they've been doing, and they do the same small data sets are used over and over again. And why might that be problematic? It's well, I mean, it's very basic, is that you can predict, you can get good predictions one system to another using systems that are qualitatively quite differently. So there's a recent paper where the authors are making this basic point. I mean, you can predict the time of a cuckoo clock really well from a digital clock. and you can perfect the prediction, but the mechanisms underlying that are quite different. And we know that confounds can drive good predictions. I mean, puddles are associated with a rain, but puddles don't cause rain. I mean, you got the wrong causal connection there. So, and normally what you do when you're trying to understand whether a good prediction is actually causally related, informative in a theoretical way, is you run experiments where you manipulate variables. That's the standard approach, but that's what people aren't doing in this world. They're just doing more and more prediction on observational data sets. So in the current context, good predictions might reflect confounds rather than an interesting similarity between these neural networks and brains. And to see how this might happen, let me just describe, this is the precursor study that I carried out, or we carried out with members of my team. They actually did all the work. So what we did is trained a model on a small, there's a data set called CFAR10, it doesn't matter. It has 10 categories and I think 6,000 members per class. So it's much smaller than ImageNet, but nevertheless has 60,000 images, and you train the model to classify images into 10 categories. And the models can do that. And then what you do is, what we did is inserted a confound in the image. So we said, okay, we're going to put, you can see that little circle, the airplane on the right is one image of an airplane from CFAR10 blown up. And the little kind of circle is highlighting a little tiny pixel. It might be hard to see, but there's a pixel, there's a little dot in there. So every airplane, we put a pixel there. And every automobile, we put another pixel in a different place. And every bird, we put another pixel in another place. So we had a confound. There was the image itself and a confound. And what we found is that the model learned, if you added those confounds, the model completely cared about the confound. It didn't care about the image. So after training it, so the model's doing perfectly. So at test, if we put the image and we put the pixel in the same place, the pixel of an airplane in the same place as the pixel was when you trained it on airplanes, it does 100% well. So it's trivial. But if you move the pixel on the image on the right, I move the pixel of the airplane into the location of a bird. So it literally looks like an airplane, but there's a little tiny pixel on the left-hand side where a bird's, the model will say confidently, that's a bird. So nobody would do that. But the model is just picked up on whatever is statistically reliable for classification. That's what it cares about. Okay. So we were arguing that that's problematic if you're trying to model human vision. But anyways, that's the context for what we're asking now is, can a deep neural network that classifies images based on a single pixel, so it works really differently than a human being, can that model get a good RSA score with brains? So we took a standard data set, the one from Krieger-Skorte's lab, same set of images, and we assessed RSA when we had a model trained in 3 different ways. One, we trained it just like they did, trained it on original images, and then we're going to see how good it does in predicting RSA. It should be good because that's what they found before. But then we had these confounds just like before. We put confounds, but we put it in a way in which the confounds kind of will mirror the representational geometry of the images themselves. So we put, for all the, remember, these images coming in inanimate and animate, and then when it comes to inanimate, we had natural and artificial. So we put a dot, or like a little patch, in the same general location whenever an image was a natural inanimate object, and we put another patch in another location if it was artificial, and so forth. So we systematically placed the pixels in a way that confounded with the similarity structure of the images in the real world. And another condition, we just randomly put there's no similar, I mean, we consistently put the same pixel in, all natural objects got a pixel in one location, but the relationship between the pixels didn't mirror the hierarchical organization of the objects themselves. And the gray line is how good you get, this horizontal bar line here, that's how good a model does when it's trained on actual images. So that's a close, fairly close replication of the earlier study. But we get just as good predictivity from a neural network when we put them strategically in the same way. This is a model that recognizes images based on single pixels. It's completely not a good theory it's by design a poor model of human vision, but its RSA is as good as, if not slightly better on average, than the models that are claimed to have RSA scores reflective of brain neural network similarity. And the same outcome comes from models of regression. We can get the same kinds of findings, a confound. And the reason, the reason it's a confound. I mean, these benchmarks that are used to make comparisons are not experiments that manipulated variables or observational data sets, and confounds can predict. So if you have a model that cares about texture, and a model, and we'll see an example, and humans don't care about something else when recognizing object, as long as the texture and the shape are correlated, you can use that as a confound to predict one from the other, even though they're using qualitatively different mechanisms. Okay, so the interim summary is that the evidence that deep neural networks are good models of the visual system depend on brain benchmarks, these kind of prediction on observational studies that might reflect confounds. I haven't proven they're confounds, but they certainly could be done. I mean, we've demonstrated it's easy to produce confounds. So, so how do you find out? Is it a confound, or are these interestingly related in a deep way? So what you run experiments. Okay, and so that's what most of my work in recent times when working with deep neural networks is we run experiments where the experiments are manipulating variables that are theoretically motivated to give insights about how the visual system works in humans. And we can do the same experiments on models and see if the models work like human beings. And I'll go through a few of these, but the bottom line is they fail almost every time completely. So here's one early study that came along that I thought was quite a striking thing that you would have thought might have led to more doubts from the start, where are these things called adversarial images. So it's possible to take these models that are really good, can recognize images just as well as you and I, but you can fool them with these things called adversarial images. So these are images. The image on the left is looks like TV static, but a model will, 99.999 confidence say that's an armadillo, and the second one's a bubble, and so forth. It's very easy to generate many, many images that are just completely implausible, it would seem, but models are absolutely confident that they can classify these things. So that seems problematic, and that continues today. All the best models. There's a lot of work in engineering circles trying to stop this, but there's not even a close solution at the moment. So these models can be fooled in odd ways. Now, there was a paper that came out a couple years back where the claim is actually, oh no, this is not a problem. I mean, actually humans are also subject to these attacks. And in fact, humans can kind of show similar patterns to models. So in a quote from their paper, we show that humans and machine classification of adversarial images are robustly related. Human intuition may be a surprisingly reliable guide to misclassification, to machine misclassification, with consequences for minds and machines alike. So the authors are arguing these adversarial images are not problematic. In fact, they reveal, surprisingly, an actual correspondence between brains and machines. And the way they did this is they would have things like this. They'd say, okay, here's an adversarial image. This is an image that a neural network will confidently say, oh, that's a pinwheel for sure. And so they presented a human being, a pinwheel or a bagel, and you say, which one do you think it is? You ask the human being that. And the model, now the model, have to be told, has 1,000 categories, and it will say, I'm sure that's a pinwheel. But in the experiment, they have two images, and they have a bagel and a pinwheel as a choice, and the human beings more often call that a pinwheel than a bagel, and they're and far above chance. So, and another condition, you have multiple images. Which image here has a robin in it, and people can look very. It might be harder to see here, but if you stare, there's some subtle details. People will much above chance select an image of a robin. Pick the image that the neural network confused as a robin. So so there's a similarity here. In fact, these things are there's a correspondence between humans and machines as a consequence of adversarial attacks. But it's actually not true. There really are adversarial. They really reflect deeply profound differences between machines and minds. So we ran some studies where we kind of replicate some of these conditions. So we have one image and two response options. It's like they did. So just like they have, an image here, is it a pinwheel or a bagel? So we do the same thing. We say, okay, here's an image. And this is an image that a model will say is a tile roof. But then you can have two different conditions. You could say tile roof versus wooden spoon, and people do really good. But if you say tile roof and shower curtain, people do really badly. So it depends on the foil. They picked foils that weren't that confusable. But remember, the model has to pick tile roof out of 1,000. I mean, all of these foils are included. If you pick, there's a whole bunch of foils that will make performance terrible on human beings. Or another condition, you have 2 images and 1 response option, but change the adversarial attack. So you can, so both pairs here, you have a pair on the left, pair on the right, the object. So this thing on the left, the first pair, that's an example of an image that a model will confidently say that's a penguin for sure. And on the next 2 on the left, and on the right, the image on the left, the model will confidently say, oh, that's definitely a penguin. Now, if you ask, you can, of all the adversarial attacks, if you pick one adversarial attack, you can find examples in which performance of a human will mirror the performance of the model, and that's on the left. But we can pick items on the right, we could pick other adversarial attacks that the model's 100% confident or 99% confident, and people will, in this case, below chance in some sense. But in any case, I'll move on. There's another, we can generate images in other ways, and performance is absolutely a chance. So there's lots of ways to make these models not look like humans. So these, and this kind of relates to what I was talking about before. Deep neural networks often classify images based on the wrong visual features. So classic, the most, the very first kind of observation, if you ask a vision scientist tell me something really, really, really basic about human vision, the answer would be, well, human vision, people classify objects based on their shape. So a classic early studies, Irv Biederman says, you can classify in this experiment at the same rate, same speed, same accuracy, a photograph of a phone and a line drawing of a phone. Take away all the texture, so they, but in any case, the main point is it's easy to recognize objects based on their shape. However, these models that get very high brain scores, they don't. So here's a model, a clever study carried out by Garros and colleagues, where they took an image of a cat, put the texture of an elephant and put it on top of the cat. So if you ask, on the image on the right-hand side, if you ask a human being, what is that an image of? People will say, well, it's a weird thing, but it's a cat. The model will say 100% confident that's an elephant, because the model is classifying images based on their texture. They don't even use shape. So again, these are the same models. And how could that possibly be? Well, texture is predictive of shape. So you can use texture to predict shape and get a high RSA or a high brain predictivity, but it's not a good theoretical account of how the model is working. Now, it turns out, so people, when they discovered this, and that, I should give an example, that's an actual example of someone doing, in my mind, modeling the right way. They ran an experiment. They they manipulated a variable. They said, oh, do you think neural networks care about shape or texture? Well, let's put texture on top of shape and see which one it cares. That's an experiment. And then it gave an answer that was completely at odds with brain score. But it's so simple, you have to run an experiment. Now, since then, people have shown that, well, we can induce a shape bias in these models. And what they do is take a model, I couldn't tell, but it turns out this is a ringtail lemur, this image on the left. And they kind of then added many, many different kinds of textures on top of that image. So now the shape is predictive of the category, but the texture is no longer. And what you can do is you can demonstrate that, okay, if you've trained a model in a way in which the environment is such that texture is no longer predictive and shape is, then you can show that the model is indeed going to show a shape bias. But it's not a very plausible way to train. Human beings don't sit around seeing every object with every possible texture. So it's not a very developmentally appropriate approach. But on top of it, even once you do that, it gets the wrong kinds of shape representation. So here's an old classic study by John Hummel pointing out that when it comes to object recognition, we kind of care a lot about not only shape, but we break objects into their parts and the relationships between their parts. So on the left-hand side, we have these objects called basis objects. I mean, just line, not really objects, but line drawings. And then he made, for each of these 6 basis objects, he made some variants. In one case, it's a relational variant. So what he did, I just circled that part. The circles is just to highlight the area in which I've altered the image, or he altered the image. So what he did is on the basis object, that little vertical line is largely above the horizontal line. On the relational variant, it's largely below. You've changed the relationship between those two parts. In the pixel variant, you move the entire arm down, so the relationships between the parts maintain, but there's actually a bigger pixel distortion. You've changed, for every pixel on the relational variant, you've changed more. You've moved the whole thing down. Okay, so he did this with, he changed the model, changed the images either by changing the parts or changing more of the pixels, and the results of a whole series of studies show that humans are highly sensitive to the relational information. So if you change, so this is studied, an image would present, another image would present, and you'd have to say, are they the same or the different? And people would make lots of mistakes on the pixel variants. So if you present the one on the left, number one on the left, and then the pixel variant on the right, people will often say the same incorrectly. They should say different, they're different, but they differed in their pixel. But very rarely would they make that same mistake. And the study was used to argue that humans in the visual system care about the relationships between parts. So we did the same thing with a neural network that's been trained in this funny way to make sure it has a shape bias. And then we ask, what is the similarity between items that have part-based relations, if you've changed the parts or changed the pixels? And the model doesn't care, it's completely insensitive to the relationships between the parts. I'm not sure of my timing here, so I'm going to just move, but I can explain this. But the bottom line of this thing is, well, there's two lines kind of overlapping each other, highlighting at no level of a neural network does the model seem any difference between objects that are defined by pixel differences or part-based differences. And that's unlike human beings. So we'd argue that's a problem if you have a model of shape representation that doesn't care about the parts and the relations. Another study where a basic thing that humans can do is the representations we have for shape can support not only classification, but a whole range of things like basic reasoning. So we can decide whether the two objects are the same shape or different shape. I mean, we can do lots of other fancy things with these things. We can reason with these representations. Simplest possible one, same, different. Are they the same or different? People have been claiming that these models can do that, but turns out that they can't. So in the past, people have shown they succeed if you train a bunch of objects just on the original stimuli here, many thousands and thousands of trials where you tell people or tell models, examples of the same, examples of different, and then you give held out examples, the model will actually succeed. But the real thing about basic reasoning is it generalizes. So having succeeded, you say, okay, well, can it make judgments about other kinds of images? And the answer is no. I mean, so if you ask it, are two arrows the same or different or not? It can't. I mean, it has no concept of same, different. It just has some kind of statistical property of a particular training set. Okay, I want to get to a language thing. So there's a variety of other kinds of studies we've done, I think, consistently failing to show models don't show similar to human performance. Let me just give an example of a language study where we found that these models can learn impossible languages in a way that seems unlike human-like. So deep neural networks of language processing, one of the standard ways of training these models is you predict the next word. So you have a series of words, the, boy, chase, the, and then you say, okay, what do you think the next word is? And then you get it right or wrong. You update the weights in this model, and you do it with massive data sets at this point. And having trained the model, it's not just the next word. You take the whole preceding sets of words to use to make a good prediction of the next word. And after a while, you can get models to do very good predictions and the sentences. And then you can do things like, okay, I've trained this model on thousands, in this case, 8 million web pages so lots and lots of words. If you can online, you can just enter a beginning. So if I entered architectures and mechanisms for language processing, and then say, okay, right, just finish, predict the next word, and then predicts the next word, predict the next word, and it will generate coherent text. So bracket AMLAP, that's from the model. Conference is it's a biannual event that focuses on the study of language processing from a computational perspective. The conference covers all aspects of language processing, blah, blah, blah. So it does a really nice job of just generating text. If you train it on Harry Potter type novels, it'll generate stories that sound like a lot Harry Potter, but novel text never produced before, it'll do these important things and impressive things. And it's led, just like in the vision case, people are starting to say, oh, well, maybe this is how humans learn language. They predict the next words and let's do stuff. And they have, and papers coming out saying, oh, we can get, RSA or neural predictivity effects, and so just giving some titles of recent papers trying to make correlations and predictions like I've been describing before. Or a quote from a Vincent Baroni paper: the behavior of DNNs might give us insights not only into online processing performance, but also into some of the core syntactic tools that constitute human grammatical competences. So people are using the impressive generation capacities of these models to make claims about language in models might be like how in the human brain. So we took a model of Gurdjieff, which was kind of a nice study which showed that you can account for a variety of linguistic phenomena, including number agreement between nouns and verbs. So we took that model and we trained it just like they did. And then we had two other conditions we included. We had one condition, but we had three other conditions where we made the language it's been trained on impossible. So in one case, we reversed the orders of words in a sentence. In another case, we had a repeated sequence of words randomly put in somewhere along, 23 words would repeat, or we shuffled the vocabulary. So let me just give you one example. So in the reverse sentence structure, we chose a random point in a sentence, insert a marker, and reverse the remainder of the sentence beyond that point. So we're just transforming the corpus the model's trained on. So originally, one sentence out of a long, hundreds of thousands of words or millions of words, this particular sentence was the man whose dog barks likes apples. And we changed it to the man whose dog marker apples likes barks. So we do that to every sentence. Every sentence has that property where we swap the second half of the sentence after the marker, making it implausible sentence. I mean, there's no syntactic language, and it'd be hard to learn these things. So, and then we assessed agreement in the same way that Gurdjieff did. So the model was presented with all the words into the sentence up to the critical verb, and then the level of activation of the two alternative verbs are compared. So the proper answer is barks, not bark. So we say, how active is barks? How active is bark? If it gets barks more active than bark, then it's understood number agreement in this context. Okay. So and that's exactly how the authors originally did it. And what we find is that the model is quite happy to learn original sentences, but it can learn reverse sentences just as well, just as easily, and repeated sentences and shuffled sentences almost as well. So, and we trained it more, and no doubt it could do better still. So I think the conclusion I want to make is that these models are missing human inductive biases that constrain how we learn languages. So these models require far more training. I mean, in some cases, you're training on, Wikipedia or, trillion words or something like this. You train on lots of things, predicting one word at a time. So you can learn to do impressive things, but it takes more data and you can learn anything. And that's not like humans. Humans have inductive biases that constrain how we learn. It has a great benefit of allowing us to learn with less data, but it constrains what we can learn. So that seems to me it's sort of analogous to one study I didn't mention, but so these studies, I said you can, in ImageNet, there's a million images in 1,000 categories, and so the models can do that. The models can equally learn 1 million categories of TV static. We could just take 1 million patterns of TV static and say, okay, the first random 1,000 go in category 1, the next 1,000 go into category 2, the next 1,000 randomly. So it's like 1 million random pieces. There's a completely lookup table. Models learn it, no problem. This is not like a human being. So the lessons from experiments with deep neural networks is models that do well on brain score and brain benchmarks account for almost no findings in psychology, at least in the case of vision. And the profound differences between these models and DNNs is only observed after you manipulate variables that are kind of designed to test specific hypotheses. So example is, does it classify on shape or texture? Well, you run an experiment, you find out. But a high brain score will not be allowed to know which one does which. So I think these models they're using a misleading measure of similarity here. So what's the way forward? Stop competing on benchmarks where good predictions of brains good predictions of brain activations don't align with good deep neural network brain correspondences. Instead, going back to testing models on psychological experiments that manipulate independent variables that are designed to test hypotheses. And I think the key finding from psychology should be that the key findings from psychology should be the primary target of researchers trying to develop biologically plausible models of mind. And analogously, I would think, people doing natural language processing, they need to pay a lot more attention to linguists rather than just kind of, from a pure engineering perspective, kind of make predictions and forget that there's a lot of data out there that are really informative about if you want your model to be like a human being. Okay, I think that's it.
Okay, thanks a lot for the talk.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. My name is Jennifer Arnold from UNC Chapel Hill.
Hi.
And I'm going to ask you a kind of big question. So when I teach cognitive psychology in a psych department, I often start off by asking my students, can machines have cognition like humans? And just like you, my interest is in like humans, right? Not any old cognition. And I'd say 20 years ago, they were very, very resistant to that idea, and they'd spend most of their time arguing against it. And over time, they're maybe kind of edging towards it, but still there's a lot of resistance to the idea. And I'm trying to get them to accept the idea that it's useful to look at computational models as a tool for thinking about human cognition. But the talk you just gave was really pessimistic about that, or at least that's how it came across to me. And so my question is, do you think, I mean, it looks to me like at least these models do a really bad job of thinking like humans. Do you think it's possible to have models that will think in the way that humans do?
I do. I mean, yeah. I'm not anti neural networks. I'm just anti the way they're assessed. I think we can get models to be a lot more like human if you kind of are constraining your models based on the right data sets. And I think psychology, but it could be neuroscience data too, but it has to be experiment, you manipulate variables that have relative, kind of inform you how something's working, and then you build in that process. I mean, either build it in or learn it. But yeah, so I don't mean to be, I'm pessimistic in the sense that I think we're far, all these grand claims that we're getting close to things, and there's somebody from, I don't know, Google or something like that was concerned that a model is conscious now. So, it's ridiculous. They're so far from that. But yeah, I'm not anti, if I were teaching your students, I would not try to discourage them from modeling.
Yeah, I wasn't about to.
Yeah, okay,
no,
yeah.
But I mean, do you think, are there other models that are doing a better job?
Well, I mean, the interesting, so I think there are a lot of good psychological models, but they're not models that recognize images in practice. And I think somehow people don't take things seriously, at least the engineers. And I understand if you're an engineer, if you want a model that can actually be useful in the real world and recognizing faces and whatnot. But that doesn't make it a good theory. It doesn't necessarily improve your understanding. A model should be less about prediction and more about understanding. So I think psychology models often do provide a lot of understanding. But I would like the models to be better in predicting and actually, solving problems in the real world too. But so I do think there are a lot better theories out there, but they're not satisfying to engineers, and but they should be satisfying to psychologists.
Thank you.
Hello, hi, thank you for the very interesting talk. My name is Olga Fehir, I'm from Warwick University, and I'm a complete outsider, so this might be a really, really naive question, but you're going back to the vision models. Isn't the difference is that human beings are not trained on static images? I mean,
Yeah.
Okay, so because we're not used to seeing objects from the same perspective, non-moving, right? That's why relational relationships are important to us.
So one possible, I don't think it'll be remotely sufficient, but one answer might be have better training environments.
Video?
And it's worth doing. I mean, there are models that are doing things. There's a thing called self-supervised learning where the objective function isn't to just classify, but to kind of predict so people are developing different learning algorithms that might actually be more plausible and more rich environments, and I definitely think that needs to be done. But the point I would make is that the models that are getting high brain scores, that are touted as the best models of human vision, are models that have only been trained to classify images, most often ImageNet. So there's a flaw in the logic that people are using prediction. I mean, I guess, it's more of a methodological point. People are using the wrong criterion. How are you going to make a model better? Well, maybe just take those models and train them better. It's possible. For instance, I think it would be very unlikely that training a model better is going to allow you to learn to encode objects by their parts and the relationships between the parts. So like we in fact tried training our models to understand the relationships between parts, and it utterly fails. So I think it's not going to get you all the way, but it definitely would get you further, I think, and it would be improved. Same thing with language. Language is not predicting the next word. The whole point is we're trying to communicate ideas. The idea that you're going to build a model that perfectly or highly captures human language based on the assumption that we're going to train it on 1 trillion words by predicting the next word, it just seems like it's the wrong objective. That's not the goal of language, to predict the next word. It's to understand something. The fact that you can get high predictions from it, or the fact that you can get, impressively coherent text is interesting, but I just don't think that's a good sign that you've got a good linguistic theory about development of language, let alone, the inductive biases of human language and so forth.
All right, thank you.
Okay, now we have 2 questions from the other side of the room.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very good. Thank you. I'm Atem from the Queensland University of Technology. My more than a question is a comment / option. You say that this model classify images, not that much about language, but if we think about it, what they do, they are looking for some semantic information about the image, and semantic, we can argue, is very much language. Now, the question is, if we start to train the model not anymore on the image, but on the semantic information, like some theories say that when we create our information in our mind, our lemma is just little part of what an object is comprised. So for example, if we think of a table, we know that it has 4 legs and has a piece of wood on top. So that's just one theory, obviously. So the question is, what if we train the model not on the images, but on this information, there are semantic information, and then we provide them images to work on that?
Yeah, well, it kind of relates to the other question, better training environments. And some of these models are doing things, like there's some model called CLIP that kind of, models that you're captioning. So you're not just kind of classifying, you're describing a scene. So you see an object and you have to cast, so there's a dog next to a bench and there's someone throwing a Frisbee. So models, and it's quite impressive. They can also make funny mistakes, but overall it's quite impressive. But yeah, if you have a joint objective of describing the scene, not only classifying, but describing the scene in words, then it might be interesting to see what kinds of, how well does that model do on classifying images based on shape rather than texture. So I take your point that one of the things that needs to be done better is improving the training environment. It may not just be classification. Definitely, it's not only classification. It's understanding scenes. It's manipulating scenes. It's understanding, reasoning with objects. There's a lot of things we can do, and we're going to need a much more sophisticated environment. My gut feeling is that it's not going to be enough. We're going to need other. You're going to need other mechanisms that are not part of current models. But nevertheless, I totally agree. Better training environments are an important test to see. Maybe they'll do better than I think.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for such an interesting talk.
Thanks.
I'm Georgia from the University of Edinburgh, and my question sort of focuses on when we think about some of the models that have been mentioned in the references in this talk. So like large-scale NLP models are engineered for a specific task, and they're very good at the task they do, right? But indeed, I think that they fail on, as you've shown, psychological measures of cognition. And then on the other side, I think about it as a spectrum where you have maybe smaller scale models that do very well on psychologically inspired tasks or experimentation. And what I wanted to ask is, how would one, as a sort of research direction, broach the gap in between, where, as you've hinted something about tailoring the training environment, it seems like recommendations that may be to do with data set or enforcing certain inductive biases to constrain the hypotheses that models can sort of explore. Essentially, I'm trying to ask about thoughts on the mechanisms behind constraining this middle ground to get like cognitively inspired models.
Yeah, good question. I mean, the first thing is I just think we need to change what we're trying to explain. If you're trying to get a model, you should be explaining psychological data or linguistic, and you should get models that try to use to understand rather than predict. But then, how are you going to improve the model? So training environment, inductive. So in the case, we haven't done anything in the case of language. In the case of vision, we've been kind of building more biological front ends, like a V1, like simple cells and complex cells, or adding various kinds of biological constraints to our models. But it's a lot easier to show that a model is not very good than it is to make a good one. So yeah, I don't have, other than, and my main thing is I think we need to change, put psychology really at the center of, and linguistics more in the center of understanding, in constraining these models out there. And how you put in hand wire some inductive biases. That's the tricky part. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Josh Hartshorn from Boston College, and this is super interesting talk. I don't know how I had missed some of these papers before. I was really excited to learn about them. I wanted to ask you about what we have, or what you feel we have learned about the mind from this, because a couple of things like jump out to me that seem super interesting. One is, apparently there are ways of solving the classification problem that look quite different from whatever we're doing in our heads, right? And that's not a priori necessarily true, right? And also raises a question, okay, so why don't we do it the way neural networks do it, right? Apparently neural networks work, like why did we come up with some other way of doing it? I suspect what you're gonna say is, well, this has a lot to do with the objective function, right? But in which case, what have we learned about how the human objective changes the fundamental computational, like is it that this changes the fundamental computational problem such that whatever neural network modern DNNs are doing doesn't work? Or is it just, for whatever reason, Darwin woke up one morning and decided to evolve humans this way as opposed to some other way? Anyway, I'm hoping you have some thoughts about this because it seems super interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, so, at some level, I suppose what, how to answer this. I'm not sure we've learned a lot about the mind from, there have been neural networks around for a long time now. There's been an explosion since, there's this classic paper in Vision 2012 by this guy, Jeff Hinton and others, called AlexNet. Now, whether we've learned a lot since 2012 that's unique to this thing, I don't know. The fact that it fails, it makes you raise questions. Well, maybe we have the different objective functions, and maybe that, like for instance, I never really quite understood what it means, like embodied cognition. It always hit me as a bit airy-fairy, and I didn't quite know what to make of it. And now I'm starting to be more sympathetic to say, well, it's not just classifying images. We need a mechanism by which we train a model in a way that it's solving, you can maneuver in a world and grasp something and problem solve. So, I think the training objective has to be more, and I don't know if embodied is the only word, but I'm starting to be more sympathetic to the idea, well, we have to change what we think is of the basic properties of vision. It's not about classification. That's just a subset. Some of these neural networks. So one of us. So I quickly showed you this image, where ImageNet, a neural network can learn 1 million categories of TV static, which just seems absurd. So one thing, I mean, I'm not sure, it's not really teaching you much about vision, but there is a reasonably easy fix to that, which we've introduced to a model to make it be constrained so it can learn realistic images and not random data, which is adding noise to the activation function. So if we just kind of add, so these models have amazing precision. There's no noise. I mean, the models that win these competitions have a ridiculous capacity. I mean, these models at this point are trained, I mean, training one of these language models or training some of these, captioning models. I mean, evidently the energy to train one model is like a year's worth of electricity in Northern Ireland, or some weird stat like that. I mean, these are massive models, and they're exploiting incredible precisions that are just not within their, so not a property of the human brain. So we need to have models that have, I suppose some vague insight about, the biological constraints that we have. We're working with a noisy system with, certain kinds of bottlenecks and so forth. That's going to have profound impacts, I think, on the types of representations that we learn. I don't know if that's a new insight or not, but in any case, I think one of the things that you can use to make models more like humans is add some of these constraints that current models don't have.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a new insight, but it does kind of feel like there's maybe a path for making that insight more.
Yeah.
More.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like having done this, I do feel, I'm asking different questions, and I do feel that it's not been just kind of completely negative exercise. I do feel like my best example, I suppose, is thinking about vision needs to be understood more in a kind of an embodied context. That's sort of a kind of a general thought I have in my head as a consequence of studying this.
Chris Cummins, Edinburgh. Great talk. I had a question. I think you may just have answered it, but I'm not sure that you did, so I'll ask it anyway.
Okay.
Which is the superhuman performance,
Yeah.
and whether we can read off from instances of that some constraint on human learning, or whether that's basically not a thing we can do because, as you point out, the training data is so vast and itself superhuman as well, so maybe it doesn't tell us so much. I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, no, I definitely think you can. I mean, so I think the mere fact that these models can do superhuman things, so they can learn impossible languages, they can learn impossible nonsense images, means you have to, and we put a constraint in our model, which is add noise. I don't think adding noise is going to solve the problem of learning impossible languages, but there might be some other kinds of constraint that you need to, or just some kind of, I don't know what the constraint would be in that case, but there'd be some interesting constraint. Yeah, so I do think superhuman performance is, there's been so much focus, actually most people are not focused on criticizing, everyone is trying to publish, it's even more like the brain. But if you do try to criticize these models, you get things which I'm a fan of, like adversarial attacks, where these weird failures of models. But equally problematic, if you're a psychologist, is superhuman performance. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm Giovanni Cassani, Tilburg University. Two things. The engineer might argue just add more parameters. GP3 works better than GP2. It does certain things that GP2 was failing at better. So what you were saying at the end, we do this with a lot fewer data, but probably still a lot more parameters in the sense of neuronal connections. Do you think there's anything to be gained in going for more parameters, or do you think it's at some point you just hit the ceiling and there will be things that you can't do? And the other thing is, where do the inductive biases come from? Question being, these neural networks are usually trained as blank states. For example, the inserting pixel manipulation that you did, what happens if you do that on a model that has been trained on real images? Does it catastrophically pick up on the pixel, or is there some sort of blocking where patterns that it picked up before are still predictive and so it doesn't learn the pixel?
Yeah, so we did that experiment. You catastrophically forget everything. So, it was a good question, Alan. blanking out. Oh, yeah, so, yeah, when you say you add more parameters, GPT-3 is bigger than GPT-2 and does better, that's true, but it does better in an engineering sense. I mean, I'm not at all sure it does better in a psychological sense. So, I mean, if GPT-3 accounts for, I mean, I'm pretty sure GPT-3 will learn impossible languages if you ask it to. So it's, you know, when someone says a model gets better by adding more parameters, it's not getting better as a theory in psychology, I don't think. But if, you know, if you can account for psychological data better by adding more parameters, then go for it. You're right, there are more neurons in the brain than the biggest neural network that's been done so far. So in principle, there are more, so I'm not anti making a model bigger per se. I just don't think, I'm more concerned about the approach of how you evaluate these models. And so maybe, you know, have a bigger model, that's fine, but don't say more models are better until you show that they're better at solving psychological findings.
Hi, Umesh Patil, University of Cologne. So my question is, probably you answered it in the previous question, but just to clarify. So one problem that you emphasize is that the models, even if they are predicting, in certain cases, they're predicting data as humans, you can add a confound and then show that they don't. My question is, even if after adding the confound, if the models did well, we still don't know how the models did that. So I think the question as a psychologist or as a psycholinguist is how the models are doing certain tasks, because we are more interested in that than just the output, comparing the output. Yeah. So I think it's the
No, I mean, I agree with you that an interesting feature of these models is we often don't know what they're doing. So a good example of that is people say, oh, look how good these models are of human vision. They're getting these high brain scores, and they didn't know that they were using texture, not shape. So, I mean, we don't know what these models are doing. But I also, at the same time, I would say it's a hell of a lot easier to learn what these models are doing than the brain's doing. You can just run much more rigorous experiments and things like this. So I agree, it's not a trivial matter to figure out what a model is doing, but I do think it's a lot more tractable. I mean, I'm all in favor of neuroscience and trying to understand what you can from the brain, but you can certainly understand what a neural network's doing better than a brain's doing. But it is another challenge. So, yeah, so on top, yeah, I totally agree with you that it's not a trivial thing.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. So thank you everyone for the lively discussion. I'm going to ask you two things. The first one is to thank the speaker for the talk. The second is to not run away after you clap, because we have a few announcements. Okay? So, thank you.